The same hands that once held you close, that stroked your hair in moments of tenderness, can also be the hands that push you to the edge of ruin. That's where this story begins, not with the crime scene, not with the police tape, but with a small American town where appearances deceived everyone who thought they knew their neighbors. Riverton, Ohio, is the kind of place most people outside of the state have never heard of. It sits quietly off a highway, framed by flat cornfields and worn-down diners that have been there longer than most of the residents. The summers are hot, the winters are bitter, and the rhythm of life is steady, predictable, almost comforting. On a Tuesday evening, you might expect to hear little more than the hum of air conditioners and the faint chatter of televisions through half-open windows. But that particular Tuesday was different. A dark sedan idled beneath a single street lamp across from a small brick house. The car did not belong there. The neighborhood was familiar with every vehicle, every face, and every routine. Yet that night, the car blended into the silence, its presence unnoticed by most. Inside the brick house, warm light glowed through lace curtains. You could hear laughter, the kind that spills out from a kitchen table where a family feels safe. To outsiders, nothing seemed wrong. To one person watching from a distance, everything was wrong, and had been for years. This story is about Elena Carter. To the world, she was just another young woman from a struggling town, raised by her grandmother after her parents left too early, caught between hope and hardship. To those who knew her best, she was bright, ambitious, and eager for something bigger than Riverton. And to the one man she loved, she was both an accomplice and a pawn. When you piece together her life, you don't find the standard outline of a criminal mastermind. Instead, you find a girl who believed in promises, who trusted the wrong person, and who paid the price in ways she could never have imagined. Elena's story is not one of sudden violence or reckless impulse. It is a slow unraveling, a tale of loyalty manipulated, of love turned toxic, and of revenge that would brew for nearly a decade before it surfaced. It began when she was 17. Riverton teenagers didn't have much to do except gather at house parties or drive the back roads with music too loud. That's where Elena first saw Marcus Lane. He was 2 years older, carried himself with an ease that made others follow, and had a smile that suggested he already knew the secrets you were trying to keep. He wasn't rich, but he dreamed out loud about the life he would build. Money, cars, escape from towns like Riverton. For a girl raised on her grandmother's warnings about poverty and wasted potential, Marcus seemed like the spark that could light a different path. Where Marcus went, another figure always lingered, Samantha Brooks. She had grown up in the same hallways and classrooms as Elena, a classmate who was neither friend nor rival, just present. But Marcus had a way of drawing people in, making them orbit around him, and soon the three of them were inseparable. They drove to movie theaters an hour away, crashed parties in neighboring towns, and spent nights dreaming about futures far from Ohio. Elena, who had always longed for a family she could trust, believed she had found one. Looking back, she would later realize that Samantha's eyes had lingered too long, that trust was already fractured, but in the moment, she only saw loyalty. The unraveling of Elena's life did not start with a gunshot or a police siren. It started with a request so small it seemed harmless. Marcus, ever persuasive, told her she was perfect for a favor he needed. "You're too innocent," he said. "No one would ever suspect you." All she had to do was return some merchandise, nothing serious, just a technicality. The first time felt wrong in her stomach, not like fear, but like the nagging sense that something important had shifted. She told herself it was love, that helping Marcus meant helping them both, and so she agreed. From there, the favors grew. Merchandise returns turned into running small scams turned into transporting packages, and soon Elena was caught in a system she barely understood but couldn't resist. The money they stashed away in showboxes felt like proof that Marcus's dreams were real. And every time she wanted to stop, Marcus leaned in close, told her she was special, told her they were in it together. That's how manipulation works, not through threats, but through affection laced with control. But here's what makes Elena's story different from so many others. She didn't just fall into crime. She fell into betrayal. Years later, when her name appeared in police files, when her fingerprints were on evidence, when her sentence was read aloud in court, Marcus wasn't there to hold her hand. He had already stepped away, leaving her alone to carry the weight. And the girl who once believed in loyalty above all else learned, behind prison bars, what loyalty really meant. When you hear her story now, it's easy to focus on the crime, the prison sentence, the schemes, the eventual bodies found in that quiet suburban house. But the truth is, Elena's crime began long before any law was broken. It began with misplaced trust. It began with hands she thought were guiding her, but were really pushing her into darkness. On that Tuesday night in Riverton, when a dark sedan waited under the glow of a street lamp, Elena's past and future collided. The laughter inside the brick house belonged to people who thought their lives were untouchable, who believed their betrayals were buried. Outside, the silence carried the weight of nearly a decade of waiting. For Elena, patience had become a weapon. This is not just a story about crime. It is a story about how love can become poison, how betrayal can shape a person into something unrecognizable, and how revenge, when fed for years in silence, can emerge colder and sharper than anyone expects. Elena Carter once believed in love. By the time her story reached that Tuesday night, she believed in something else entirely. To understand what happened in Riverton, and why the name Elena Carter would later appear in police files, you need to step back to where her story really began. Crimes like this don't come out of nowhere. They grow from roots planted years before, in the soil of family history, childhood struggles, and the choices made when a person is too young to see the traps ahead. Elena was born in 1992 to a mother who was present in name only and a father whose life revolved around jobs that barely kept food on the table. By the time she was 9, her parents were gone, her father to another state chasing employment, her mother lost in her own battles with addiction. That left Elena in the care of her grandmother, Miss Darlene, a woman already weathered by years of raising children who weren't her own. Miss Darlene was tough, steady, and unapologetic. She woke Elena every morning before dawn and made her repeat the same phrase, "Education is your way out." She believed that school, discipline, and focus were the only escape from Riverton's cycle of poverty. For a while, Elena believed it too. She did well in school, had dreams of studying business, maybe even leaving Ohio for a college somewhere bigger. But Riverton is the kind of town where opportunity feels more like a rumor than a promise. The local factories had closed down long before Elena was old enough to work. Most of her classmates drifted into low-wage jobs or simply stayed stuck in the orbit of their parents' mistakes. And Riverton had its share of temptations, small-time hustles, quick money schemes, and people who had figured out how to bend rules without getting caught. That's when Marcus Lane entered the picture. Marcus wasn't from a family much different from Elena's. His father worked odd jobs, his mother took shifts at the local nursing home. But Marcus carried himself like he was meant for something more. He was smooth-talking, with a kind of confidence that seemed to bend the air around him. At 19, he already acted like the world owed him a debt he intended to collect. When Elena met him at that party on River Street, she was 17 and impressionable. The kind of impressionable that comes from being raised with strict rules and the weight of expectation, then suddenly finding yourself in the orbit of someone who seemed free of all of it. Marcus noticed her right away, called her college girl with a smile that felt like a spotlight. In the dim light of a stranger's basement, with music rattling the walls, Elena thought maybe she had finally been chosen for something bigger than Riverton. And then there was Samantha Brooks. Samantha had gone to school with Elena since grade school. They weren't close, not in the way girls sometimes become inseparable, but they weren't strangers either. Samantha was quieter, watchful, the kind of girl who rarely drew attention but seemed to notice everything. Marcus pulled her into the fold quickly, and soon the three of them were seen everywhere together. To outsiders, they looked like just another trio of teenagers wasting time in a small town. But for Elena, it felt like family. Family mattered because Elena had spent most of her life chasing the feeling of belonging. Miss Darlene gave her discipline and stability, but she couldn't give Elena the warmth of parents who tuck her in or the easy laughter of siblings at the dinner table. Marcus and Samantha filled that void. Late-night drives, cheap dinners, endless conversations about what's next. It was intoxicating. For the first time, Elena wasn't the girl holding herself together alone. She was part of something. Still, there were cracks, even in the beginning. Samantha's gaze lingered on Marcus more than Elena ever noticed. Marcus's promises always sounded a little too big, too good to be true. But when you're 17 and hungry for love and loyalty, you ignore the signs. Elena ignored them. Investigators looking back years later would note this pattern, the way Elena gravitated toward people who made her feel essential. Her grandmother's mantra had drilled into her the idea of self-reliance, but in practice, Elena wanted connection. Marcus gave her that, even if it came laced with manipulation. It wasn't long before Marcus tested the boundaries of that loyalty. He started small, asking Elena to return a few items to a department store. The logic was simple. She looked innocent. No one would suspect her. She hesitated at first, But Marcus pressed. "We'll use the money for that weekend trip you keep talking about," he told her. And when she walked out of that store with cash in her pocket, the rush of adrenaline mixed with the glow of Marcus's approval. For a teenager who had never been told she was special, it was enough. Samantha was always there too, watching, participating just enough to be part of the schemes but never putting herself fully at risk. If Marcus was the one pulling the strings, Samantha was the one silently reinforcing them. To Elena, it seemed like teamwork. To everyone else, it was clear Elena was being groomed to take the biggest risks. From that point forward, Elena's trajectory was no longer her own. She didn't see it then, but every choice tied her tighter to Marcus and further from the life Miss Darlene had dreamed for her. Each scheme grew bolder, each rationalization easier. And every night, when Marcus kissed her forehead and said she was the only one he could trust, Elena believed it. What defines a criminal? Is it the act itself, or the slow erosion of boundaries until wrong feels normal? For Elena, the line blurred long before the law noticed. She was no mastermind, no hardened schemer. She was a teenager in love, eager to belong, and blind to the fact that her loyalty was being weaponized. By the time Elena turned 19, the girl who once recited "education is your way out" every morning had abandoned college applications. Instead, she was driving long hours across Ohio with Marcus's instructions echoing in her ears. Samantha was still there, silent, steady, and closer to Marcus than Elena wanted to admit. What Elena couldn't see was that the loyalty she clung to so fiercely was already one-sided. In hindsight, detectives would describe Elena as the perfect mark. She had no criminal record, no history of violence, no reason for anyone to suspect her. She blended in, the picture of innocence in a town that didn't look too closely. That innocence made her valuable, not to herself, but to Marcus. Every story has a beginning, and Elena's did not begin with violence. It began with longing, for love, for belonging, for escape. It began with the promise of something better, whispered by someone who knew exactly how to exploit her. And so the stage was set. Riverton had raised Elena to believe education could free her. Marcus taught her something else entirely, that freedom could be bought, stolen, or taken. Samantha learned alongside them, though her loyalty would one day shift in ways Elena could never have imagined. Elena Carter was not yet the woman who would emerge years later, hardened by betrayal and prison. She was still just a girl in a small town, caught in the gravity of two people who would change the course of her life forever. And as every investigator who touched her file would later note, by the time Elena realized the danger she was in, it was already too late. Crimes that make headlines rarely start as headline-worthy. They begin with something small, something so ordinary it could almost be dismissed. For Elena Carter, the first steps into crime looked nothing like the later accusations tied to her name. They began quietly, disguised as favors for someone she trusted too much. By late 2009, Elena was working part-time at a discount department store on Riverton's main road. Her grandmother, Miss Darlene, was proud that Elena held a steady job while finishing high school. Elena herself saw it as just a step toward independence, a way to save money for college applications and the freedom she longed for. But for Marcus Lane, it was an opportunity. Marcus had already tested her loyalty once with the return scam. It was simple. He would steal merchandise, Elena would return it with a receipt he had managed to manipulate, and the store would hand her cash or credit. The first time, Elena's heart pounded in her chest, her palms sweating as she slid the bag across the counter. But the cashier barely glanced at her before processing the return. No questions, no suspicion. She walked out with money in her hand and Marcus's approval glowing in his eyes. That approval meant everything to her. After that, it became routine. A jacket here, an electronic gadget there. Marcus showed her how to change outfits, how to rotate locations so no one noticed patterns. He praised her, telling her she was the reason their schemes worked. Elena wasn't blind to what she was doing, but she convinced herself it was harmless. No one was getting hurt. The stores were insured. And the money meant she was building something with Marcus. Weekends away, late-night dinners, small luxuries she had only dreamed about. What Elena didn't see was that her role was deepening. Marcus never put himself directly in the line of risk. Samantha rarely did more than keep records or scout opportunities. Elena was the face, the one with the clean record and the innocent demeanor. She was the one who would be remembered if anyone looked too closely. By the spring of 2010, the scams had escalated. Marcus talked about bigger opportunities, hinting at connections he had beyond Riverton. Elena wasn't sure what he meant until he asked her to make a delivery. He told her it was just transportation, nothing illegal, nothing dangerous. You don't even have to look inside, he said. Just drop it off and come back. Easy money. Elena hesitated. She had always known Marcus's plans flirted with the edge of legality, but this was different. Driving someone else's car, delivering packages she wasn't allowed to open. It sounded like something from the crime shows she sometimes watched late at night. But Marcus's words were smooth. He reminded her of the money they had already made, of the dreams they had talked about, of the future she claimed she wanted. This is just one run, he promised. If you don't like it, you never have to do it again. She agreed. On a Thursday morning in June, Elena found herself in the parking garage of a downtown Columbus office building. Just as Marcus had described, a blue sedan waited with the keys under the mat. She slid into the driver's seat, her heart racing, and started the engine. She didn't open the trunk. She didn't want to know what was inside. For the entire 45-minute drive to a warehouse on the edge of the city, she checked her mirrors, convinced every car was following her. At the warehouse, a man she didn't know waved her in, took the keys, and told her she could leave. Within minutes, she was back in her own car, Marcus's voice on the phone telling her she had done perfectly. Later, he handed her $500 in cash. More money than she had ever made in a week at her department store job. That was the moment the boundary crumbled. From then on, one delivery turned into several. Each time, Marcus assured her it was nothing serious. Just transportation, he said. You're not touching anything. You're not selling anything. You're just driving. But the packages grew heavier, the locations more distant. Elena began to notice details she couldn't ignore. The men who never gave names, the addresses in neighborhoods she had been warned to avoid, the way Marcus always kept a careful distance. The money, though, was intoxicating. Elena had grown up counting every dollar. Now she was stuffing envelopes of cash into a showbox under Marcus's bed. They counted it at night, whispering about the future they would build. A business. A house. Maybe even moving out west. For the first time, Elena believed escape from Riverton was possible. But it came at a cost she didn't fully understand. Investigators who later pieced together Elena's history would note how textbook the pattern was. A teenager from a fractured home, manipulated by an older, charismatic figure. The grooming was subtle, not threats, but promises. Not force, but flattery. Marcus knew how to make her feel indispensable. I couldn't do this without you, he often told her. For Elena, who had spent her life longing to matter, those words bound her tighter than any chain. Friends from high school noticed the change. Elena, once quiet and focused, started skipping classes. She stopped talking about college. Her weekends were consumed by trips out of town. When asked about Marcus, she defended him fiercely, insisting he had big plans and that anyone who doubted him was just jealous. What Elena couldn't admit, even to herself, was the gnawing sense of wrongness that lingered after every job. She would lie awake at night replaying the moments, the cashier's glance, the weight of the packages, the way strangers' eyes lingered too long. It felt dangerous. But then Marcus would call her my girl, pull her close, and remind her of their dreams. The fear melted into loyalty. And then came the mistake. It was a rainy evening in September when Elena was pulled over on Interstate 70. The police said it was routine, a broken taillight, nothing more. But as she sat in the driver's seat of a borrowed car, her hands trembling on the wheel, the officer's eyes narrowed at the nervousness she couldn't hide. They asked to search the vehicle. When the trunk opened, the gym bag inside revealed more than Elena wanted to know. She was arrested on the spot. In the records that followed, Marcus's name appeared only briefly. He wasn't in the car. He wasn't anywhere near. The packages were traced to Elena, the car to an untraceable rental. Elena was the one in handcuffs, the one facing questions she couldn't answer. Marcus didn't visit her at the station. Samantha didn't call. The loyalty Elena had given so freely evaporated the moment it mattered most. That night marked the true beginning of Elena Carter's descent. The department store scams had been small, even laughable in comparison. But the moment she sat in that interrogation room, staring at the evidence spread out on the table, she realized she had crossed into something far darker. What she didn't realize, what no one realized, was how that night would plant the seeds of everything that came after. The prison sentence, the betrayal, the years of silence. The revenge she would one day unleash. Elena's story didn't make the news then. She was just another young woman caught in the wrong place with the wrong people. But the first events, the small choices, the lies she told herself to justify them, those were the steps that led her to become the woman investigators would one day struggle to understand. And in Riverton, the people who thought they knew her had no idea that the girl who once dreamed of college was already on a path towards something much darker. When Elena Carter was first booked into the Franklin County Jail, she thought the nightmare would end quickly. She believed Marcus would come for her, that he would find a lawyer, post her bail, and remind her that they were a team. Instead, days passed without his face appearing behind the glass of the visitation room. Weeks stretched into months, and Elena began to realize what everyone around her already knew. She had been left behind. The charges were serious. Transporting controlled substances across state lines was not a matter of community service or probation. Prosecutors painted her as a willing participant in a larger network. Elena insisted she never opened the packages, never knew exactly what she was carrying, but intent mattered less than the evidence. The trunk of the borrowed sedan told its own story, and her fingerprints sealed her fate. By the end of her trial, the jury had little trouble convicting her. She was 19 years old when the judge sentenced her to 9 years in federal prison. The words rang in her ears like a death sentence. 9 years. Longer than she had been in high school, longer than she had ever stayed in one home. She turned to look for Marcus in the courtroom, desperate for a familiar face. The bench was empty. He hadn't even bothered to show up. At first, Elena tried to hold on to hope. Maybe he was staying away to protect her. Maybe Samantha, her supposed friend, would visit and explain that this was all temporary. That illusion shattered 2 months into her sentence when she received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar, the words devastating. "Dear Elena, I wanted to let you know that Marcus and I got married last month. We've moved to Columbus and started a new life. Marcus asked me to tell you that he's sorry things worked out the way they did, but he's moved on now. We both have. I hope you can find peace." Samantha's signature was the last thing Elena saw before the paper slipped from her hands. In that moment, something inside her broke. The loyalty she had given freely was repaid with betrayal. The man she loved and the friend she trusted had chosen each other, leaving her to rot behind bars. Prison life has a way of stripping people down to their essentials. For Elena, it was an education more brutal than anything Miss Darlene had warned her about. The routines were harsh, the noise constant, the danger unspoken but ever present. Yet amid the chaos, she discovered a truth that would define the rest of her life. Survival wasn't just about strength. It was about patience. Her cellmate, a woman named Cookie, had already served 7 years of a long sentence. She looked at Elena with something between pity and warning. When Elena broke down after learning she was pregnant, Cookie was the one who told her the rules. "You'll carry that baby in here, but don't think you'll keep her. They'll take her from you the same day she's born." Cookie was right. When Elena gave birth to her daughter, Maya, she held her for less than 24 hours. The tiny infant, with her wide eyes and faint smile, was placed in Elena's arms, and for one day she believed maybe there was still a reason to hope. Then the guards came. They pried Maya from her arms as Elena screamed, begging for just 1 more hour, 1 more minute. Her grandmother, Miss Darlene, was waiting to take the baby home, but that did little to ease the wound. Watching her daughter leave the prison without her was the most agonizing moment of her life. That loss hardened her. Elena cried through her first months in prison, but grief slowly gave way to something colder. She began reading everything she could find in the prison library: legal cases, true crime books, stories of revenge. She learned about alibis, about people who waited years to strike back, about the difference between rash violence and calculated retribution. She absorbed stories of women who had been betrayed and men who had destroyed lives piece by piece. In those pages, Elena found a mirror of her own pain and a blueprint for what patience could accomplish. Other inmates noticed the change. She was no longer the naive girl who trembled in the corner. She worked out in the yard, listened more than she spoke, and asked the kinds of questions that suggested she was planning something beyond survival. One older inmate, known as Linda, told her, "The best revenge isn't loud. It isn't a gunshot in the night. It's quiet. It's when they think life just turned against them, but really it's you pulling the strings." Elena listened. She learned. And she waited. The tension between her past and present grew sharper with every passing year. On the outside, Marcus and Samantha were building a life together. Social media posts showed them smiling in front of new cars, new houses, vacations. Elena studied those glimpses when contraband phones circulated in prison, memorizing every detail. To others, it looked like jealousy. To Elena, it was research. Inside, she was transforming. Each betrayal replayed in her mind until it no longer stung but fueled her. The girl who once sought approval from Marcus was gone. In her place was a woman who understood the power of silence. She spoke little to guards, kept her head down during inspections, and cultivated an image of compliance. But beneath that facade, she was taking notes, mental ones at first, then scraps of paper hidden away, about how to disappear, how to mislead, how to create doubt. Her sentence became her training ground. Investigators looking back would later remark on the irony. The prison meant to reform Elena had instead refined her. She walked out after 9 years not rehabilitated, but recalibrated. The escalation of tension in her story wasn't just about the crime she committed before prison. It was about the transformation that happened inside. By the time Elena stepped out of the correctional facility in 2019, she was 31 years old. She carried a plastic bag with her few belongings and no one waiting at the gate. The world outside had moved on, but the fire inside her had only grown. She returned to Miss Darlene's home, where Maya, now 9 years old, greeted her with cautious eyes. The reunion was bittersweet. Elena wanted to hold her daughter, but the years apart had built a wall only time could break down. And then there was the other wall, the one between her and Marcus. He believed he was safe, insulated by distance and years. But what he didn't know was that the girl he betrayed in 2010 had become a woman shaped by silence, sharpened by patience, and fueled by loss. The escalation of tension was complete. Elena Carter's story was no longer about survival. It was about what happens when betrayal festers long enough to become something more dangerous than rage, calculated revenge. When Elena Carter walked out of the Ohio Correctional Facility in March of 2019, she was no longer the girl who had gone in. She had entered the prison system at 19, naive, easily swayed, loyal to the wrong people. She left at 31, a woman molded by betrayal, hardened by grief, and sharpened by years of watching and waiting. Freedom was supposed to feel like sunlight after years underground, but for Elena, it felt more like stepping into an unfamiliar landscape. The world had changed while she was gone. Cell phones had transformed into small computers, neighborhoods had shifted, and the people she once knew had either disappeared or moved on. She carried her belongings in a clear plastic bag, climbed aboard a bus, and rode back to Riverton as if returning from exile. Her grandmother, Miss Darlene, was still alive, still steady, though older and more fragile. Waiting at the house was Maya, now 9 years old. The daughter Elena had held for only 1 day as an infant was now a child with wary eyes and the cautious politeness of someone meeting a stranger. The reunion was tender but strained. Elena wanted to scoop Maya into her arms, to make up for the years lost, but children don't bridge gaps on command. They need proof, consistency, time. Elena understood, even if it cut her deeply. In those early weeks, Elena worked on rebuilding the small pieces of her life. She found part-time work through a re-entry program, helped her grandmother around the house, and tried to create some sense of routine. But beneath the surface, another routine was taking shape, one driven not by survival, but by purpose. Marcus and Samantha had not disappeared. In fact, they had flourished. A quick search online revealed smiling photographs of them in Columbus, standing in front of a new home with a white porch and neatly trimmed hedges. Marcus posed beside a black BMW, Samantha in running gear after a neighborhood jog. They looked settled, safe, untouchable. For most people, seeing such images would bring bitterness, maybe even despair. For Elena, it brought clarity. The years in prison had taught her a lesson she would never forget. Patience is a weapon. Revenge is not loud or reckless. It is cold, calculated, and deliberate. The turning point came one quiet evening in May. Elena was scrolling through a public social media page when she saw Marcus tagged in a photograph at his favorite barbershop. The caption was casual, the kind of post people make without a second thought. But for Elena, it was a revelation. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't cautious. He believed the past was buried and forgotten. That arrogance was the crack in the armor she had been waiting for. From that moment, her focus shifted. She began to treat her life like an investigation. She gathered details the way detectives gather evidence. She noted Samantha's jogging route, Marcus's work schedule, the shops they frequented, the people they spent time with. Everything was available, laid out casually on the internet for anyone who cared to look. Elena cared. She cared enough to document every post, every pattern, every inconsistency. At the library in Riverton, Elena spent hours on public computers, piecing together more than just routines. She researched Marcus's old associates, revisited articles about men he owed money to, and dug into the criminal underworld that had once brushed against their lives. One name surfaced again and again: Derek Vaughan, a middleman who connected dangerous people with desperate ones. Years earlier, Marcus had borrowed money from Vaughan to fund one of his schemes. The debt had never been repaid. Elena remembered the arguments, the whispered warnings, Marcus brushing it all off with bravado. But men like Vaughan didn't forget. Here was the opening. Elena didn't need to raise a hand herself. She only needed to remind Vaughan where Marcus was. With precision learned from years of listening in prison, she began creating a profile that could be slipped into the right hands. Marcus's address, his schedule, his cars, the routines he and Samantha thought no one noticed. Elena drafted it like a report, impersonal and exact. It was less about revenge and more about evidence, the kind of evidence that could guide someone else to settle an old score. Yet even as she planned, Elena maintained the outward life of a mother trying to start over. She attended church with her grandmother, walked Maya to school, and smiled politely at neighbors. No one would have suspected that late at night, after the house grew quiet, she sat at the kitchen table scribbling notes, mapping out the lives of two people who had once meant everything to her. The turning point wasn't only about what she was planning against Marcus and Samantha. It was also about what she had become. The Elena who entered prison had believed loyalty was worth any cost. The Elena who left knew loyalty could be a trap. She had no illusions left about love or friendship. What she valued now was control, the ability to decide how the story ended. Investigators later reviewing the timeline would note how careful she was. There were no impulsive moves, no reckless confrontations. She watched from a distance, documenting. She tested her own patience, making sure the opportunity was real before acting. Where another person might have exploded in rage, Elena simmered in silence. Her daughter, Maya, became both her anchor and her cover. Elena knew she had to appear stable for Maya's sake, to avoid raising suspicion. But she also knew Maya was a reason to act, a reminder of the life Marcus and Samantha had stolen from her. For 9 years, they had lived free while Elena missed first steps, first words, birthdays, school plays. Every smile on Samantha's social media page was a taunt, every photograph with Marcus a reminder of betrayal. The true turning point came not when Elena decided she wanted revenge. That decision had been made long ago in a prison cell. The real shift came when she realized she had the means. With Vaughan's name in her pocket and Marcus's arrogance leaving trails across the internet, Elena finally had the tools to turn patience into action. On a warm June morning, she rented a car with the small savings she had managed to accumulate. She drove to Columbus, an hour from Riverton, and parked a block away from Marcus and Samantha's house. For 4 days, she watched. She took notes on their routines, snapped photographs with a prepaid phone, memorized license plates. She didn't approach. She didn't speak. She simply observed. For Elena, it was confirmation. Marcus wasn't careful. Samantha wasn't cautious. They believed their betrayal was buried under years of silence. What they didn't realize was that silence was the very thing that had kept Elena alive, and that silence was about to end. The turning point of Elena Carter's story was not dramatic in the traditional sense. It wasn't a sudden act of violence or a headline-grabbing confrontation. It was quieter, colder. It was the moment she shifted from victim to orchestrator, from waiting to acting. And though no one else knew it at the time, the countdown had already begun. The deaths of Marcus Lane and Samantha Brooks shook their Columbus neighborhood on a warm August afternoon in 2019. To neighbors, the couple had been the picture of stability, a young husband and wife with good jobs, a neat home, and friendly smiles when they jogged past or waved from their driveway. That illusion shattered when a neighbor, concerned after seeing their front door ajar, stepped inside and discovered what investigators later described as a professional execution. The details of the crime scene never made it fully to the press, but insiders noted how clean it appeared. No signs of forced entry, no scattered belongings, no chaotic struggle. The victims were found in the basement, their positions suggesting they had been subdued quickly and efficiently. Detectives Sarah Whitfield and Daniel Harper, both seasoned in homicide investigations, agreed on one thing immediately: this was not random. It was targeted, deliberate, and carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing. From the beginning, suspicion fell on Marcus's past. He had been charming in public, but his criminal history was hardly invisible. Old records showed fraud schemes, theft, and connections to small-time hustlers across Ohio. Most concerning was his unresolved debt to Derek Vaughn, a name that carried weight in both police files and street corners. Vaughn was known as a middleman, the type of figure who connected clients to muscle, information, or illicit goods. He had a reputation for patience and a refusal to forgive unpaid debts. Detectives pulled old files, noting that Marcus owed Vaughn more than $20,000, money borrowed and never repaid before Marcus reinvented himself as a family man. That was motive enough. When Vaughn was brought in for questioning, he didn't flinch. "Marcus owed me," he admitted flatly. "I collected what was mine." But he denied any involvement in the murders. "I got my money." That's where it ends. What happened after that? Not my business. The problem for detectives was that his story, however slippery, matched the evidence they had. The safe in Marcus and Samantha's bedroom had been emptied of nearly the exact amount Marcus owed, no more and no less. To investigators, that detail suggested Vaughn had indeed been there, but whether he was also responsible for the killings was harder to prove. Still, Vaughn's name carried enough notoriety that the public was ready to accept him as the likely culprit. Yet not everyone on the investigative team was convinced. Detective Whitfield, in particular, couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Vaughn was ruthless, yes, but also methodical. If he had collected his money, why escalate to murder? Why risk the additional attention of a double homicide when intimidation alone had served him well in the past? The deeper they dug, the more questions surfaced. How had Vaughn known Marcus's exact schedule? How had he known the layout of the house, or the fact that Marcus kept cash in the safe? Vaughn's organization had resources, but there was a level of precision here that suggested inside information. That trail led them, unexpectedly, back to Elena Carter. Her name surfaced when Harper cross-referenced Marcus's old arrest records. She had been his girlfriend during the time of the fraud schemes, arrested in 2010 for transporting contraband. She had served 9 years in prison and been released only months before the murders. The timing was conspicuous. When detectives visited Riverton to speak with her, Elena presented a picture of calm normalcy. She was living with her grandmother and daughter, working part-time, and attending church on Sundays. When asked about Marcus, her voice didn't waver. "I haven't spoken to him in years," she said. "After everything that happened, I cut ties." She told them she was home with her daughter and grandmother the night Marcus and Samantha were killed. Both confirmed her alibi. On the surface, it held. A quiet evening, a family movie, nothing remarkable. But Whitfield's instincts whispered otherwise. The investigators looked for cracks. Phone records, financial statements, vehicle rentals. Elena was cautious. The prepaid phone she had used for her surveillance had been discarded. The rental car was under an alias tied to cash payments. There was no direct line connecting her to the crime. What they found instead was small curiosities: her sudden interest in library computers, her quiet detachment when asked about Marcus, the faint flicker in her eyes when Samantha's name was mentioned. Still, suspicion alone doesn't close cases. Vaughn's notoriety and Marcus's debt provided a cleaner narrative, one prosecutors were eager to pursue. Vaughn was indicted on charges related to the stolen money, and while his guilt in the murders remained murky, the trial painted him as the architect of the crime. Elena's name faded into the background once more, just a footnote in Marcus's troubled history. For Elena, that was the resolution she had orchestrated all along. She had no need to gloat, no desire to confess. Her silence was a shield. She had learned in prison that the best revenge left no fingerprints, no confessions, no dramatic confrontations. It was cleaner to let others carry the blame, to let old debts and old enemies take the fall. Neighbors in Riverton saw her as a woman starting fresh, a mother who had made mistakes, paid her time, and was now focused on raising her daughter. Maya, cautious at first, began to trust her. They shared quiet evenings, school projects, bedtime stories. For Elena, the life she presented to the world was enough to mask the life she carried in her mind. But behind that mask, the turning point had already passed. The murders of Marcus and Samantha were not random, and Elena knew it. They were the final act of a betrayal repaid, a chapter closed not by violence in the moment, but by patience stretched over nearly a decade. Detective Whitfield never forgot the case. She wrote in her notes years later, "Vaughn had motive, yes. But Carter had silence. If she was involved, she left no trace." And maybe that's the scariest kind of criminal, the one who never breaks cover, the one you can never prove. In the end, the resolution of the case rested on the public conviction of Derek Vaughn. The community accepted the explanation. Newspapers reported the murders as the consequence of old debts catching up to Marcus Lane. Life in Columbus moved forward. For Elena, the investigation's conclusion was freedom. She could walk the streets without fear of suspicion, attend PDA meetings, and sit in church pews with her daughter at her side. To everyone else, she was simply a woman who had survived a hard past. But the truth lingered in the shadows. Elena Carter had transformed her betrayal into a blueprint, her patience into power. The investigation ended with Vaughn behind bars, but the conclusion belonged to her. She had rewritten her role from victim to orchestrator, from pawn to ghost. And as she tucked Maya into bed at night, whispering that everything would be all right, she knew that the story was closed in the only way that mattered, her way. The file on Marcus Lane and Samantha Brooks was officially closed in late 2019. On paper, the case had been solved. Derek Vaughn, the notorious middleman with a reputation for settling old debts, was tied to the missing cash, and prosecutors built their story around him. In court, he was painted as a ruthless enforcer who finally collected on what Marcus owed. The jury didn't need more than that. Vaughn was convicted, and the neighborhood in Columbus breathed easier. But those who looked closer, detectives like Sarah Whitfield, knew that something about the resolution never quite fit. Vaughn might have had motive, but the precision of the crime, the timing, and the details suggested a guiding hand, someone who knew Marcus intimately. Whitfield's got told her that Elena Carter's shadow lingered behind the case. Yet suspicion is not proof, and proof is what the justice system requires. So the file was stamped closed, the case archived, and the questions left unspoken. For Elena, this was the ending she had shaped for nearly a decade. She built her new life carefully, quietly. Each morning she woke in her grandmother's home, made breakfast for her daughter, and walked Maya to school. To neighbors, she was simply a mother trying to rebuild after hard years. She worked a modest job, attended church, volunteered occasionally, and kept her circle small. There was nothing flashy about her, nothing to invite attention. The more ordinary she appeared, the safer she became. But in the privacy of her thoughts, Elena carried the weight of everything she had lost, and everything she had reclaimed. Prison had stripped her of youth, of freedom, of the chance to raise her daughter through childhood. Marcus and Samantha had stolen her trust, her loyalty, and the family she thought she had built. But through patience, Elena had taken back something they never expected: control. She didn't need to confess it. She didn't need anyone to know. The very point of her transformation was that silence was her greatest weapon. People expected revenge to be loud, obvious, destructive. Elena had learned that the most devastating form of revenge was invisible. By the time the world caught on, it was already over. There were moments, though, when she let herself feel the enormity of it all. At night, when Maya was asleep and Miss Darlene's house creaked with the weight of age, Elena sat alone with her thoughts. She replayed the letter Samantha had sent her in prison, the betrayal carved into every word. She remembered Marcus's promises, his charm, his voice whispering that she was the only one he could trust. She remembered the day Maya was taken from her arms, the scream that echoed through the prison walls. And she remembered the cold determination she had forged from that grief. The lesson was etched into her: never mistake loyalty for safety. Trust, once broken, can transform into something dangerous. For Maya, Elena tried to offer something different. She helped with homework, listened to stories about school, and worked hard to prove that she was reliable. Their relationship was fragile at first. 9 years of distance cannot be bridged overnight, but slowly, cracks healed. Maya began to lean against her mother on the couch, began to reach for her hand when crossing the street, began to believe in her presence. Detective Whitfield, meanwhile, never stopped wondering. She kept the Carter file tucked away, sometimes pulling it out late at night in the precinct when cases went cold. She highlighted passages, scribbled notes in the margins, wrote one simple phrase again and again: if she did it, she's better than anyone realizes. Whitfield understood something that others didn't. The absence of proof was not proof of absence. In many ways, Elena's life after prison became a paradox. She was free, but she was also trapped by the need to keep her silence. She could never speak of what she had done, or what she had orchestrated, but she lived with the satisfaction of knowing she had rewritten her own story. She was no longer the naive teenager betrayed by love and friendship. She was the woman who had survived, adapted, and emerged stronger. The community saw her as an example of rehabilitation. Teachers praised her involvement with her daughter's schooling. Church members spoke of her humility and quiet faith. Employers noted her reliability. To them, she was proof that people could change. Only Elena knew that her change had less to do with reform and more to do with refinement. And that is where the lesson lies. True crime stories often focus on the visible violence, the bloody climax, the moment of chaos. But the most dangerous crimes are sometimes the quiet ones, the ones orchestrated in silence, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary lives. Elena Carter's story is not about a sudden act of rage. It is about the slow burn of betrayal, the long patience of grief, and the transformation of a victim into someone capable of shaping events from the shadows. Her story forces a question that lingers long after the case file is closed. Was she a victim who finally found justice, or was she a perpetrator who escaped it? The truth may lie somewhere in between. She was both. She was the young woman who lost everything to the manipulations of others, and she was the adult who learned to manipulate the world in return. For those who followed the case, the official ending was neat. Vaughn was convicted, Marcus and Samantha were gone, and Elena was free to live her life. But the unofficial ending, the one whispered in detective notes and unspoken suspicions, is more unsettling. It reminds us that justice is not always about what can be proven. Sometimes, justice is about what cannot be traced. Years later, when Maya was old enough to ask about her father, Elena faced the question she had dreaded. Sitting at the kitchen table, she told her daughter that he had made mistakes, that he wasn't the man he should have been, and that life had forced them apart. She didn't speak of betrayal, or prison, or revenge. Some truths, she decided, were burdens too heavy to pass on. The lesson, instead, was simpler: trust carefully, watch closely, and remember that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. In the end, Elena Carter's story is not just about crime. It is about the hidden power of patience, the way betrayal reshapes the soul, and the thin line between justice and vengeance. And for those who still whisper her name in connection with a crime no one could prove, one reality remains unshaken. The most dangerous person in the world isn't the one who threatens you. It's the one who waits, quietly, until you've forgotten they exist.